Hello, I'm Mike Vizard, your friendly neighborhood moderator for this video cast, which is called Assessing the Kubernetes Landscape. Turns out we're in front of KubeCon in Europe, and it seems like we're making a lot of progress. We've been talking about Kubernetes now for, I don't know, it feels like a half a dozen years or more, and finally we're getting to the point where people are starting to operationalize that. So we got together some of the experts in the space, and we're going to have a little chat with where are we in Kubernetes and the general ecosystem. We've got Gianluca Arbenzano, who's an SRE for Influx Data. Gianluca, welcome.
Thank you.
We've got Dan Garfield, who's a Chief Technology and Evangelist for CodeFresh.
Hey.
Then we've got Sherry Ipzan, who's a Senior Product Manager for WhiteSource, a provider of tools for analyzing open source security.
Hi.
Hello. And then finally, we've got Parker Edwards, who's a Sales Engineer Manager for Lightstep. Parker, welcome.
Hey, Mike, thanks for having me.
All right. Let's just jump in here for a minute with where are we? And we'll start with Gianluca, since he's got the big SRE title here with this question. And our first question is Kubernetes really mature enough at this point to deploy at scale? I mean, we've been scaring people now for years, telling them Kubernetes is hard. It's a platform for building platforms. And I think it kind of sends a message to the average IT organization that maybe they're not ready for Kubernetes. But where are we in terms of the ability to deploy that? Do I need to be an SRE, or can I be a mere mortal?
Yeah, I think looking at the use cases is ready. I mean, it's scaling. It definitely requires knowledge and, like you have to know what you are doing. But when you run code in production, that's a requirement, or you're gonna learn it in a bad way. So you have to know what to do and how the tools that you are leveraging works. And Kubernetes brings a lot of tools, a lot of code, a lot of integration that you have to figure out. But the architecture proved to be mature, and it comes from use cases and scenarios where scalability is crucial. So I don't have any concerns about saying that Kubernetes scales and it's ready. The fact that we see more type of workload running on Kubernetes says that that's one of the reasons why it's ready. The main issue is definitely that it's complex, but there is nothing wrong about saying that it is complex. It's made to be complex and to cover a lot of use cases. It is an abstraction layer. So by definition, when you do and build an abstraction, you are like increasing the complexity because you're gonna be able to switch the underlying cloud provider, for example.
Parker, I wonder which is more complex these days, the actual Kubernetes cluster or all the stuff that I need to wrap around it, including the storage, the security, the networking, the management tools, and do people really appreciate the level of scale that's required to succeed here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair question. When I look at the landscape, I mean, I almost see them as, I don't think you can isolate them one or the other necessarily. I think a lot of the reasons that we've seen, at least, folks driving towards Kubernetes adoption is that in-state vision, the proper orchestration, the resiliency and redundancy that's afforded by, Kubernetes as architecture. Or infrastructure, but you can't get to that point without kind of all of the things that are ancillary to the platform itself. Obviously, secrets, observability is a huge one within that realm, but I really don't think you can necessarily isolate them. That said, I certainly agree with Gianluca that it's scalable and it's already out there. We have seen a lot of like folks who I think you would normally maybe align as like a laggard in the tech adoption curve. You know, financial institutions, in general, organizations that have historically been very risk adverse, now going full bore on Kubernetes. You know, you look at some of the larger financial institutions, and there are hundreds of open job recs just for you know, Kubernetes, knowledgeable Kubernetes engineers.
Do you guys think that that's become maybe the big issue in terms of holding back people from adopting Kubernetes at a broader level? Is there's just not enough skills out there? I don't know, Parker, you seen enough people?
You know, I feel very blessed to be able to work, you know, not only at you know, Lightstep where I work today, but also in the organizations we work with, to be able to work with very skilled engineers and developers across the board. But I also am the first to concede that that's a very one-sided view of the world. I could certainly see that, but would be very interested in hearing the perspectives of you know, the panel here, because I've been blessed with working with fantastic engineers and seeing those fantastic engineers overcome hurdle after hurdle in adopting Kubernetes, you know, 3 or 4 years ago before you had managed offerings like you do today.
Right. Hey, Gianluca, I'd love to get your opinion on that real quick, Gianluca, because you're pretty deep in the community as a whole. So what are you seeing from the likes of CNCF in terms of efforts to broaden the community?
I mean, I remember that back in the day, it was like 4 years ago, it was almost impossible to have a Kubernetes running locally in like a one command like fashion way. And now we have like maybe 10 different ways to run it locally in an efficient way, in an effective way. Even you can even run it in CI and without any major issue. So I think it's getting easier, but you also have to figure out your needs. So sometimes, you know, if you are a developer and if your company is made by like 3 people that are working on the product, it's very hard for me to suggest you to onboard Kubernetes like from zero. But there are cloud providers that has services, or almost everybody now does a Kubernetes as a service. And I think that's one of the reasons about why you can pick the level of complexity that you can onboard. So don't do that if you don't take Kubernetes from zero in bare metal or in VMs managed by yourself. If you are a 5, 10, 15, 20 people product company that has to be focused on delivering features. If you see benefits on running it by yourself, that's on you. But I think you should really think carefully about what you are happy to own other than what you are happy to like give to somebody else. So there is nothing bad about saying, I'm a product company or I don't care about Kubernetes. I just know that it's important because it gives me an API that I can leverage. It gives me a cross-cloud provider features that decrease vendor lock-in. So there are points that you don't need to be a developer or like having a strong set of skills to use Kubernetes, but you have to be wise on what you pick. And
yeah, I definitely agree with Gianluca. I think that if we look at the benefits of Kubernetes, like, you know, the broad adoption in the cloud native community, it's a great ecosystem of actually supporting, it has a great ecosystem of supporting tools and interfaces, but we have to focus on, you know, as an organization, we are here not in order to just run Kubernetes for fun, but we have our business goals. So I think it's very important not to forget it, because sometimes we see organizations trying to adopt Kubernetes. They're so excited about it, and they're excited about, you know, running it by themselves. I definitely think that sometimes, or even most of the time, a managed service would be the right option for, you know, both smaller organizations, but also larger organizations that don't necessarily need this this level of customization. So it's definitely a possibility.
Well, and to add to this accessibility and kind of this idea of, well, are there enough people? I think sometimes this discussion we have around complexity is really to our detriment. because Kubernetes is complex to understand and get into, but it's complex in the same way that a car is more complex than a horse. Now, you would never choose to stay on the horse. It's like, well, I just feed it, I stick it by water, and it just kind of takes care of itself, and then we ride it. Riding a horse is way harder than driving a car. Kubernetes is in many ways much, much easier than the old way that we used to do things. It's complex to understand the entire stack, but in terms of actually operating it, I used to go and set up VMs, right? And I would like SSH onto the thing and spend 20 minutes configuring it. That felt easy, but Kubernetes is obviously more complex, but deploying a manifest to Kubernetes and having it spin everything up, that's way easier than what we used to do. So I think actually we should while we caution people that, hey, you can't just show up and do what you've always done and then have it work, because this is going to operate differently. But once you get there, this is actually going to be way easier, way more efficient, way more cost effective than what you've been doing.
Hey, Parker, you go on some sales calls from time to time, I imagine.
Once or twice, yeah.
Do you think that there are other platform providers out there that are kind of denigrating Kubernetes with, faint praise that goes something like, awesome platform, but it may be a little too complex for you, and that's contributing to some of the noise we hear about the complexity of Kubernetes?
Oh, 100%. I mean, even the folks you'll see out there in the world, a lot of people who jump in and are quick to praise Kubernetes, but on the other side or in the same breath offer a managed Kubernetes platform or a competing alternative to Kubernetes. I just before moving down, I did want to go back to just what Dan said. I think especially knowing that we're going into KubeCon EU here, one of the most important things I think that the cloud native group or cloud native collective of developers, I guess the folks here on this call and the folks who might be listening into this could do to combat that feeling or stereotype that Kubernetes is too complex to adopt, and certainly too complex to adopt at scale, is to share the stories. Like what Dan described, where you just deploy a manifest. It's almost magic when you see it happen for the first time. And I think sharing those wins, sharing those kind of moments where you can have something to look at in the not too distant future when you're actually fully deployed and you've gone through all of your hurdles of growth and productionizing your instances. Just giving folks something to be really excited about is, I think, one of the most important things we could do to combat that thought that's out there in the industry, whether from developers or those vendors or providers that might say in the other breath, Kubernetes is too complex. We got to share those wins.
All right. Hey, Dan, I'd love to get your thoughts on what the relationship between Kubernetes and DevOps really is. If I have Kubernetes, does it kind of force me to embrace DevOps? Do they go hand in hand, or, well, which one of these is the chicken and which one of these is the egg?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it dovetails with what you were just saying about how we talk about our value of our services versus Kubernetes. Like, do we have to denigrate? Like, oh, Kubernetes is great, but you need X. The thing that I always tell people is, if you want to unlock the full power of Kubernetes, right, then you're going to need to do some extra things, right? But the value of Kubernetes, and we actually surveyed people a while ago. This is a project that Google Cloud actually led, where they asked people why they were getting Kubernetes. And it wasn't, number one, wasn't scalability. It wasn't failover, reliability, any of those things that we commonly think of. It was developer velocity. Their number one thing that they were thinking about was, we think that our engineers are going to be much more efficient if they're deploying to Kubernetes. And that's possible because Kubernetes by its nature is idempotent, right? It's declarative, and it solves these things that in the old world, like if you're deploying to VMs, you're issuing a patch. You don't patch Kubernetes. You destroy and recreate, right? Totally different way of approaching it, but it means that your software delivery flow can be so much more efficient. And that means that your DevOps should get better as you adopt Kubernetes. Now, I'm sure that if you just drop Kubernetes into an org and you don't do any training and just say, this is what you're doing now, you're probably going to have a hard time. But it's one of those things that it kind of encourages you to take advantage of what's there to improve your DevOps, to improve your velocity, and get into that mentality where you're deploying, you know, potentially multiple times a day. And obviously that depends a little bit on your use case, if that's the right thing to do or not. But I guess it's neither chicken nor egg. It's the guy holding the hand of the chicken as it walks across the street.
So to follow up on that, what is the relationship then between where I put my CI/CD platform and Kubernetes? Do I need to put it on Kubernetes, or can I build apps for deployment on Kubernetes on my existing CI/CD? And if I do move it to Kubernetes, what's the benefit?
Oh yeah, and I definitely want to jump on this one because this is something that's very near and dear to my heart. Obviously, we built our whole platform is built on top of Kubernetes. One of the issues that people face when they don't move into Kubernetes is they're left maintaining this sort of a bunch of magic snowflake VMs where they have to support all of these different kinds of configurations on different VMs. And that is very costly, it's very time consuming. And you end up not just even on the overhead, but just to spin up all the machines when you need them is very costly. Whereas if you're running your CI/CD on Kubernetes, it means you have to be using a container-based architecture, and not all are created equal. There are some differences there, but that by its very nature means that instead of having a team maintaining VMs to match all my CI/CD needs, I have a team maintaining Kubernetes and keeping it running effectively, and then I just execute on top of it. And they're all vanilla to me. I don't care. I don't care really what you're running underneath Kubernetes. Maybe you're using CentOS, maybe you're using Ubuntu nodes. Doesn't matter to me. I'm going to deploy containers, and I'm going to have containerized pipelines, and I'm going to get the infrastructure that I need based on what I declare that I need, and it's just going to spin up and run on the VM on these clusters.
Do you think, if I take that to its next logical conclusion, then that I'm going to see more of a disposable approach, as it were, to my CI/CD platforms? I'm going to spin them up for short-run projects and then spin them down again, as opposed to, I feel like today sometimes when I look at what people are doing, they spin up a CI/CD platform and then it stays up forever, but no one's using it, and we get this kind of Frankenstein experience.
Oh yeah, you're totally right. I mean, the whole value of using Kubernetes is I have these pods, right? And I throw them at Kubernetes, and Kubernetes will bring nodes as it needs them, auto scale up, auto scale down. I can use preemptible nodes. So my infrastructure costs around CI/CD should go down dramatically. When I worked at Atlassian before I joined CodeFresh, I think we saw our CI/CD bill, once we moved it onto AWS, go from about $20,000 a month to $400,000, $500,000 a month. And that represented a lot of inefficiency because just because of where we were back then. We didn't have Kubernetes. Now, once you have that, and you can do these really short-lived processes, and you can pack them tightly on the nodes, and the nodes can spin up and spin down, yeah, your infrastructure should feel disposable in a sense, because it's just spins up to what it needs, goes away when you don't need it. And this actually matches the way that people develop software. You don't have an even distribution of commits and builds throughout the day. You have big peaks and then giant valleys at night where nobody's building anything. So you should be paying for nodes at those times. And instead of building some complex, logic to manage that, you can rely on Kubernetes API to scale up and scale down.
All right. Hey, Sherry, I'd like to shift to you for a minute, because I am certain that many of the security people just listened to Dan and had a bad case of indigestion. If I have all these platforms that are spinning up and down and everything is kind of somewhat ephemeral, do you think that this will force the DevSecOps issue that people are starting to talk about? And keep in mind, we've been talking about DevOps for 10 years, and I don't even know if people are even starting to have this DevSecOps conversation yet.
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's a process. I think we're definitely not there yet. As we are with DevOps, most organizations are starting to adopt DevOps, but they're not fully there yet. And in the DevSecOps world, as you said, we're even earlier in the stage. But I definitely think that, of course, if we think about traditionally, security teams were slowing up the development process. So you cannot really do DevSecOps and you cannot do CI/CD if you have this security team that is a bottleneck and basically needs to approve any open source component that you want to deploy into your software, or basically just a bottleneck within the organization. So the idea with adopting DevSecOps, specifically when speaking about Kubernetes, is sort of like building these processes of, first of all, of course, you have to have the CI/CD, but then the next step would be to really adopt these processes of, continuous testing, take that from the functional level of testing and sort of implement that into the security world. So this means like having an automated process to scan your dependencies as part of your CI/CD process, or have all kinds of policies in Kubernetes. So there are definitely like some very good and quick tools that you can use in order to start implementing DevSecOps as part of Kubernetes. And I think it's really critical to sort of incorporate the DevSecOps best practices, especially, as you said, because container applications are immutable, and also they have multiple layers of abstraction. So if we think about it, it's really hard to sort of do the security aspect as we were used to doing it before, like traditionally. So we have to really keep on to these processes, and I definitely think that DevSecOps is sort of mandatory when we're dealing with modern infrastructure, and specifically Kubernetes. So we need to make sure that basically we secure everything in terms of like secure by design, but also manage the secrets and, do the vulnerability scanning and everything like that.
Do you have any advice to how to deal with that on a cultural level? Because historically, security guys have been kind of taught not to trust developers, right? Basically, developers didn't think much about security, and they would write code and they were rushing to get to a deadline. And now we're asking the security people to trust the developers to be part of the process. So do we have to put everybody back in some sort of, research area where they can all get to know each other again, or what?
So it's all about the processes, and it's all about the maturity of the organization. But definitely, I think that the developers have to be, and they are, more aware of the security aspect. So it's really from the very early stages of coding, like seeing if before that you were, just developing your entire code, deploying to production, and then the security person would have sent you an email, see, you have a security vulnerability in production, please fix it. So today we really try to focus on the left side, like the earliest stages of development. So for example, a developer today can have an IDE plugin to IntelliJ or Eclipse that shows him the vulnerabilities as they actually write the code. And this, even if they don't do anything with it, they know that they have vulnerabilities in the code. And then the next point would be, okay, if I'm using GitHub, for example, or Bitbucket or any other tool to actually, as a repository, I can see my security issues there as GitHub issues. And then when I do the code review, or when I just add the pull request, the approver of that pull request can see that I have 5 vulnerabilities, and then they take this into account, and they actually think whether they want to approve my pull request or they want to reject it based on the security aspect as well. So it's really sort of like shifting both the awareness and the responsibility to the development teams. And then, of course, if we're already like building the environment, like let's say using CodeFresh, for example, so we can fail builds if they have security issues, which is a great example for like how you actually enforce the security aspect. And the developer is not surprised. Of course, they know they had the vulnerabilities and they didn't do anything with it. So I think this is one of the places where it's both the processes, but it's also the right tools to have in order to manage the DevSecOps idea in this CI/CD.
All right, so what I think I got out of that was you want to push security in the application development motion as far left as possible, almost to the point where it's not a separate function, it's more part of the quality assurance motion for the developer.
Exactly.
And then on the other side of it, though, we still need the security people to define the policies and maybe test that things have actually been implemented in what I might refer to as a Ronald Reagan trust but verify kind of way. Is that right?
Exactly. So the security teams, they're not free now. They still have their work, and what they basically have to do is to define the right policies for the organization. So for example, a security person can say, okay, we can deal with low vulnerabilities, but critical vulnerabilities cannot go into production. This is like a very basic level of like policy. Another thing that they can do is they can look at the actual vulnerabilities that we have, and they can prioritize them based on whether or not they're relevant to the organization. So for example, if there is a vulnerability that's only relevant if you don't have a firewall, and the security person knows that we have a firewall, it's not relevant. So sort of like having this prioritization in place and sort of setting both the policies, but also going over and giving their input in terms of they're still the security people, they're still the experts on the security, and the developer cannot, they don't know everything about security, of course, even if they have their responsibility.
But this whole security thing goes really deep, because when I thought about this question, I thought, well, people should have been doing DevSecOps before. And if they didn't think it was important then, I fear that they won't think it's important now still. Certainly the tools are way better, but even just the other day I saw on Reddit, someone was posting that they were connected to a prod cluster and they accidentally deleted all pods. And they were like, oh, I'm going to use a different, alias so that I know when I'm connected to prod in the future. And it was like, why are you connecting to prod at all? That's a terrible idea. This is a bad way to do this. You should use an automated system for applying all of these changes always. And the idea that you have random people connecting to prod is terrible. So people are still doing bad security things in Kubernetes, and it hasn't done anything to just change their mind suddenly. So I think like what White Source is doing is so important, because they're out there evangelizing and saying, look, you can do it. There's easy tools for doing this. There's easy ways to do this, but you have to believe in it as a culture, as a team. Because if you don't put it as a top priority, you're going to get hosed no matter what.
Dan, are there things that we can do inside the CI/CD platforms to kind of enforce those policies and best practices, or how will CI/CD evolve in the age of DevSecOps?
Why, yes, there are. Absolutely. So one of the things and we actually did a roadshow with White Source somewhat recently, where we actually talked about creating policy and then using your CI/CD to enforce it in a place where the developers maybe can't override it, right? So you can actually set up staged kind of pipelines where you have pipelines that developers control, and you have pipelines that security and operations control. And in order to get deployed, you have to go through both of these stages, and you can actually catch it before it gets deployed and say, actually, sorry, we can't even merge this pull request. We won't even look at it. This is back on you, this security issue that you need to deal with, and push it back to developers. And they need to be empowered to do that, and operations people need to be empowered to do that. And then they also have to take responsibility for making sure that the deployments, the applications are always, accessing things with like role-based access controls, where they have proper kind of operational stuff. But certainly from a CI/CD pipeline perspective, you can automatically be checking for vulnerabilities and then enforcing policy. And the only way that people should be deploying is through a CI/CD platform. They should never be doing it manually. They should never be connecting manually. and that will enforce the security right there and keep people from deploying bad stuff. And at the same time, they can also be checking for new vulnerabilities, because remember, people are almost always hacked because they have known vulnerabilities that have been deployed for the last 6 months or the last year. So if you have a good CI/CD platform and you have a good DevOps tempo and a good security tempo, you can actually be pushing out security changes automatically and taking care of problems so that you're not dealing with stuff that's been in the wild. Everybody knows about these vulnerabilities for months or years. And that's where people really get in trouble.
All right. Hey, Sherry, I'm going to ask you this first, and then I'd like to get everybody else's opinion. But do you think that containerized applications are more secure, less secure, or as secure as your traditional monolithic application? And I'm asking because, you know, monolithic apps, we're supposed to patch them, and of course we don't, but we can rip and replace containers, but we may or may not. And then again, we wind up with all these different microservices, and we don't know when they all connect to each other. So are we better off or not?
Exactly. So this is a great question. I think that one of the things that we always have is you have the challenges in both of them. Some of them are the same. I mean, you know, connecting to production is something like, as Dan mentioned, connecting to production is something that is relevant both on monolithic application, whether you're running servers or you're running it on Kubernetes. It's the same thing. So security issues will always be there. I think that definitely one of the challenges with Kubernetes is the immutability, but it's also one of the great advantages because, as we said, you know, if you have, let's start with open source. So as long as you deploy frequently and you are updated in terms of dependencies, you have a lot of less of a chance to actually get hacked. So about 90% of the vulnerabilities, open source vulnerabilities, have already been fixed in a later version. So let's say that we have an automated tool that will always patch and just upgrade to the latest version of the open source. And we have tests in place to make sure that this is not breaking anything, of course, in the background. We are basically preventing ourselves from getting hacked by around 90 to 95% of the vulnerabilities. So this is a great tool to actually it definitely leverages Kubernetes, because this is one of the great advantages of Kubernetes. You can deploy basically all the time.
All right, Gianluca, as an SRE, are you sleeping better at night these days or not?
I think Kubernetes doesn't fix bad habits or workflow for your company or your team. So it definitely, like, changing technology may you know, fix some of the security issue you have, but it will open for new one. So everything is mainly driven by the culture you can build with your team and with your company. So I sleep well enough, let's say, but I sleep better every day more than we have more people focused on infrastructure as a code, or we have a deployment team now that help us to deliver better and more efficiently. So building workflows and CI, like a stronger CI documentation, is what makes me to sleep better. It's not definitely changing tools or changing programming language that helps me in a way.
I once asked that question to a fellow, and he said, I sleep like a baby. I sleep for 2 hours, I get up, I cry for 2 hours, I sleep for 2 hours, I get up and I cry for 2 hours. Parker, there's a lot more moving parts apparently. We're seeing that everywhere we go. And if I look back at monitoring tools in general, you know, they were heavily used, say, on the infrastructure level. And then as we got our way up to things like APM platforms, they were used sparingly because they were costly and people only use them for their most important applications. And I pretty much had to have an engineering degree to make any sense of the APM data anyway. Is that changing in the land of Kubernetes? Is the monitoring function becoming more of a requirement across the full stack, or what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I'm biased, obviously, working at a company that builds observability tooling. But I've been in the APM industry for years now. Started out at a traditional APM provider. And I think I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a prerequisite, but it's an inevitability. The complexity that's introduced by Kubernetes or containerization, I think even in general, it just creates what we like to think of as deep systems or a deep systems problem, where you've got a lot of different dependencies, the reliance of which or the interreliance of which becomes very abstracted to the individual developer. It becomes almost impossible to understand, pre-deploy how is my change going to impact all of my upstream dependencies, 2 or 3 layers up, and how does that change how I'm going to interact with my downstream dependencies. And we've seen, going into organizations that are new to adopting Kubernetes or new to adopting a more observability focused approach to understanding the behavior of their applications, that they've been able to do a lot of good with legacy monitoring approaches or just looking at logs or looking at metrics. But there becomes a point where the clusters get too large, where the complexity gets too great, that it's just, you lose dev velocity. And going back to, I think I'm not sure who said in this panel, but one of the largest concerns that we hear time and time again with folks about to adopt Kubernetes is a loss in dev velocity. And I think that if you want to make sure that you can have those robust, frequent deployments, is you can make sure that your changes are going to do what you expect and really execute on that vision of really tight continuous delivery, a robust platform that can implement security, vulnerability testing, or all of the things that you want Kubernetes to do. You also have to understand how those different moving pieces interact with each other. And at a certain point, it's inevitable, I think.
Gianluca, you guys make a time series database, I think, and so I'm curious, is the underlying architecture for the monitoring platform changing because we need to track all these things more in real time?
Yeah, we do a time series database, and our architecture changed a lot if we compare what we used to run in the version 1 and what we are developing now with the version 2. Mainly because definitely Kubernetes increase the amount of complexity, because we have one layer more to monitor, or one layer that can cause any trouble. But more in general, you have to look at way more softwares and way more application, as you pointed out. So I think the troublemaker here is not Kubernetes at first, but it's the distribution of your code and how you build your code. So even when we move from back in the day, when I used to work for a company that had transition to cloud providers, and that was already a big step forward for the dynamic environment that we have today with Kubernetes. And even there, the way the companies used to monitor their application had to change. And this is the same now with Kubernetes and containers, because there is one layer more, and there are more applications that are connected with each other. What we saw changing is what in databases is called cardinality. So there are way more the shape of data that you have to when you move to Kubernetes is different, because let's think about 10 years ago we had host names, and they was almost fixed in a lot of environments. So you have your 1,000 of host names, and they was there, and you refer to them and you call them by name and you know where they are and so on. But with pods, that's not what you can do anymore. Pods change frequently every time you create a a job, it gets a new name. Every time you create a new pod, it gets a new name. Every time you do a deploy, like a set of pods change, so you have different host names as well. So you start to look at something different. So you start to look at labels. So your pods get labels, and those labels get a build context on your monitoring system. And this context usually is it's made from a lot more information that we used to monitor in the past. And when you design a database that has to cross-reference all these different values, the index and the architecture you have to build is different. So definitely the way we do databases and the way we do the foundation of monitoring system is different and requires some change. But it's mainly driven by the different distribution that we are developing with microservices, with containers, than Kubernetes itself.
And I would just chime in there to reinforce that I do think that there are, certainly there's a need for real-time understanding. But again, if you're, I think, living in this world where you, hopefully in an automated fashion, are killing, killing pods that are non-functioning or that are more latent when you look at the broader population, I think just as important as the ability to jump in and understand real-time behavior and the impact of all of these different connected nodes, it's also important to be able to go back in time because I think a lot more now than we have been historically, we are having to diagnose and understand last week's performance issues in this week's sprint and plan around how are we going to deploy fixes for something that we're trying to solve that our orchestration layer is taking care of for us automatically to make sure we're not going underwater, but it's still problems that need to be fixed. It's becoming way more of a balance, I think. So just as important.
Yeah,
that historical is definitely valuable, especially as you look at impacts over time. So like if you have a degradation in system performance over time, it'll show up little by little as you grow. And so every week it will be within fault tolerances. But if you can go back like 3 months, which a lot of, logging providers and performance data retention, that's where they make the money, is on how much retention they give you, right? But if you can go back a few months, then all of a sudden you can say, oh, actually, like my load times have tripled over 3 months. But when you're looking at week over week, it's like, oh, it's all within, negligent, small changes here. So it's fine.
Yeah.
The frog that doesn't notice he's getting boiled.
Yes, exactly.
Something that also had to change for us, at least, is has Parker and Dan pointed out, is how you interact with those data. So you have way more data than you used to have, and as most as you can aggregate and manipulate them at query time, best you can be and effective in understanding how the environment is working. So at Influx, we are developing Flux. It is a new query language that is able. One of the reasons about why we are developing that is because it will be able to go and get data from different databases or different services, because there is also a different distribution of all those information. So you may have logs that are in Elasticsearch, you will have time series data that are in Prometheus, and you will have traces that are in InfluxDB or whatever. You are able to mix them in your architecture. So the ability to use all those information where they are, to compute them and to get value in a very easy and effective way is also something that is required, because writing data is one of the, writing all those metrics and storing all those metrics efficiently is one side of the spectrum. But if you store them and you can read them and you can get value out of them, you can just don't store them at all.
I would love to get your guys' opinion about what exactly we will be monitoring going forward, because I feel like we're starting to see this two-party system starting to emerge in Kubernetes. It looks like this. There's a crew that says we should just deploy Kubernetes on top of existing virtual machines and we can use all our existing tools and we get isolation. And then there's a camp that says we should get rid of the VMs and kind of just go to bare metal or lightweight VMs and shrink the stack altogether. Parker, what's your sense of what are you seeing from customers? Are you seeing any trends in terms of how people are deploying Kubernetes or where and when?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the most exciting aspects of the Kubernetes ecosystem to be watching right now. Both on the bare metal side, we've gotten to work with some great customers that are looking at using Kubernetes in environments that I think traditionally were the stomping grounds of VMs, where you have GPU acceleration, where you have a requirement to be able to run really flexible hardware accelerated ML workflows, things that you require the I guess being closer to the actual hardware than what you would get in a typical in a typical Kubernetes on like a cloud environment would give you. I think the other side though that is just as interesting to watch is the rise of managed Kubernetes. And we're seeing with a lot of our customers, kind of in the same way that I saw at New Relic, organizations eager to shift from on-prem to cloud for the benefits that that provides. Folks are also looking to make that jump to Kubernetes, but I think have been waiting until you've got a robust group of offerings on the cloud or IaaS side that can actually manage some of this infrastructure for you. You see that with GKE, you see that with AWS's Kubernetes offering, and the adoption of those services we see rising pretty dramatically. But I wouldn't say we're necessarily surprised by it. I'll be interested to see how multi-cloud fits into that story and what vendors come out to try and satisfy those use cases. But I definitely think that we're at a point now where the ecosystem is mature enough that it's not just how do I, if I'm an organization looking to adopt Kubernetes, how do I deploy that within my environment? The question now, I think the first question you're asking is, do we want to go through the effort to deploy that infrastructure ourselves, or should we just buy it off the rack?
Jean-Luc, are you seeing much the same thing? Do VMs play a role here, or are they kind of fading out over time?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think like one of the value that Kubernetes brings into the game is the idea that everything you will build will be on the Kubernetes API mostly, so you will be able to go wherever you want at some point if you really need. So my expectation is definitely that multi-cloud and all the SaaS offers that we see offering Kubernetes will get more traction, and I think we'll get more traction also for as we said before, because I hope that the companies will use them to be focused on what matters most to them. That we may not be like the CNI configuration of the best runtime container out there because maybe they don't really care. So I definitely see like there is a lot to watch there. So I don't know where we will end up being. I was joking on Twitter a few days ago about the idea to build to see a cloud provider going out that is fully like Kubernetes driven. So you just see the API server from Kubernetes and you get all the services from the kubectl and the API server. So I think that would be one of the possibility as well. Just, Kubernetes is a powerful API abstraction. So that's the entry point for whatever will come next. Because there is a huge community that is already building on it and is already like friendly using it for their purpose.
I get the idea here that it's going to be more complex, and we might see bare metal out at the edge, and we'll see the cloud guys still doing Kubernetes on virtual machines, and the data center will be somewhere in the middle for years to come. And I also understand that complexity creates a argument for managed services, but we've been talking about managed services in this business for, 30 years, and they may account for 15% of all the ways IT is consumed. So what makes you think that internal IT organizations are going to give up control anytime soon? Dan?
Well, the trick here is actually that it's like everything else. The old services don't actually go away. So like if you switch to serverless, no more servers, right? Well, no, you just have a different endpoint, right? Someone has to manage the servers. So while there are some growing kind of bare metal, like Kubernetes just on bare metal installations out there, and it is growing a little bit, anyone who's doing it at scale today is using VMs with Kubernetes on top. If you take GCP on-prem and you want to do GKE in your own data center, you have to deploy VMware. So this is growing mostly on the edge. So if you go into a Chick-fil-A, you go into a Starbucks, they often have Kubernetes clusters that are sitting in the store. And I actually am not sure, but I would imagine that those ones are probably just bare metal, just sitting there. And in edge devices, that kind of makes a little bit more sense because you don't have like a fleet of machines to balance between. So it's just like, you know, huck a couple of appliances in there and call it a day. But the abstraction is less about the existence and use of those technologies and more about the endpoint that you expose. So like Gianluca was saying, Kubernetes is the API. That's the thing that survived. That's the thing that's going to stick around for a long, long time, is the Kubernetes API. Now, what's going on behind that? Question marks upon question marks. Whatever works best, whatever is going to work best is going to work best. Right now, that's VMs running in the background. But at the end of the day, what you expose to people, and this is what operations teams have learned to love about Kubernetes, is they say, look, I'm going to run a Kubernetes cluster and a bunch of clusters. I'm going to provide the infrastructure, and you're going to provide manifests. They're going to run on top of that infrastructure, and that's your problem, and this is my problem. My nodes, they're going to stay up, and I'm going to provide enough nodes that you can do what you need to do. But at the end of the day, if your app isn't working because you have a container that's misconfigured, that's now something that you get to solve, which is better. Because in the old world where I used to email, this is way back, I used to email a patch to my systems administrator to go and apply, and then something went wrong. And now I have to like go find that person and stand next to them to look at the problem with them. This is a much worse situation. Operations really is hungry and wants to give the endpoint to the developers so that they can focus on the things that they're really good at, and the developers can focus on the things that they're really good at. And this is where SREs become, you know, the golden children, where they get to live in both worlds and really make sure things run properly.
All right. Well, speaking of SREs, Gianluca, what is your sense of how automated things will get? And, you know, am I going to have machine learning algorithms and AI everywhere? And we won't be arguing about how the Kubernetes clusters get managed anymore.
I mean, I think it's wrong to see the SRE, the operators for Kubernetes in any way. I think SRE is just, it's a new name in some way, so it gets correlated with new technologies. But SRE doesn't really take care about like Kubernetes. We take care about the how your application like is understandable and debuggable in a system. So we at Influx, we have a team that is we call deployment team, and they help us like figuring out the best strategy to get our code out there and to you know, integrate well with the Kubernetes API and things like that. As a SRE, we try to figure out how the tons of metrics that we generate, that all those application generates, can help the company to figure out what's going on in production. So there is very small like overlap between SRE and Kubernetes, at least at Influx Data those days. It used to be different when we started to onboard Kubernetes, mainly because the SRE team was the one with the knowledge about the Kubernetes world. But it wasn't really like meant to be like that. We just had the people that knew Kubernetes first, and that's it. So back in the day, we used to be as a team, the people like pushing Kubernetes to the developer and in the company. But right now we have different teams, and SREs are back at trying to figure out variable information from the metrics and from the application. So if you are developing an application and you don't know how to monitor it or how to instrument it properly, and what's important to for an operator to know about your application, that's where we play a game, and that's where we try to help developers and operators, because we can understand the code and we can kind of figure out what the operation needs, and we try to help those two to speak. We are translators, let's say, in some way. But yeah, I mean, there is no way that the reason why SRE exists is because there are, as we say before, like there are way too many metrics that we can look at, or that one person can look at, like from zero. So we generate so many metrics from the API server in Kubernetes. Our application generates so many metrics that join them together to get something valuable, it's hard. So in some way you have somebody that is like looks at them and helps you to drive automation, because data are crucial. Like you can have, you know, when you build CI gives you tons of metrics that you can use. So how many times a function fails, how long it takes, which team is causing so many red build, or how much drift you have in your configuration when you do infrastructure as code and you click the merge button on the UI, and how much it takes for that change to go to production. All this kind of stuff, all this kind of workflow generates metrics, and those metrics need to be understood. They need to be used to drive the evolution of the company. And so Kubernetes definitely generates a lot of them, even more if you enable like audit log, as you should do. And so keep order on that chaos is what we do as an SRE. But yeah, I mean, I'm not very into machine learning or similar, but I see that the automation has to go closer to the time series data in a way or another. So I think we will get there soon, because it's getting too hard.
All right, let's take 1 minute each here, guys. Going round robin, we'll start with Shiri. What is your best advice to people short of buying something from your company when it comes to transitioning to Kubernetes? Shiri?
You know, I think Shiri's laptop might have died, it looks like. So I would imagine she might pop back on here, but.
All right, let's go to Dan then with that same question.
Yeah, so I thought a lot about this because it's something that we talk about all the time. And my advice to people coming from the old world is to try to forget everything that you've done before. Because when it comes to how you handle disaster recovery, how you do capacity handling, how you do rollbacks, how you handle the software lifecycle, all of it should be different than what you've done with VMs before. And the most common mistake I see is people transition from VMs to Kubernetes is they just overspend on VMs. They just over provision a lot because they're used to how long it takes for VMs to provision versus pods, where your pods should be starting in a matter of seconds, not minutes. You know, a good gut check. I actually know an organization where they looked at how long it took for their Java pods to start versus how much time they spent doing garbage collection. And they just turned garbage collection off because it's more efficient for them to let their pods run out of memory and die and restart than it is actually to do garbage collection on the pods that are running. So that's it's a little bit out there. It's a little wild, but keep that in mind. I mean, this is going to work differently than what you've done before. It's going to be better. And if you can kind of try to forget the way that the VM stuff worked and focus on learning the Kubernetes way, you're going to be much, much better off.
All right, Parker, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I would say, very much in line with Dan, things work differently in the Kubernetes world. So find a community to jump into. I think the problems that you're likely to run into are problems that other folks have faced or have very innovative solutions to. If I can suggest a community, I would certainly say the open telemetry community. We're moving so quickly towards a world where the entire infrastructure is going to be speaking the same language, from Kubernetes natively egressing metrics and logs and trace data to your networking layer, your service mesh layer, down to the libraries and frameworks that you're using in your application stack. I think getting on board that train and being ready to be able to emit your own application metrics and your own application traces in the same language that all of the other cloud native software and cloud native infrastructure and platform providers like GCP and Azure are going to be emitting. If you're ready to adopt that day one, which, tons of folks talking about this at KubeCon, go find some folks, sit down at a table and just, figure out how to get started, because it will give you such a huge advantage. You'll be in a position where if you have to ask the question, where in my stack is my problem coming from, at least you'll be well equipped to answer it.
Great. Gianluca, best advice?
I will stay with the pick the right amount of complexity that you can handle. Everything is gonna be different. You have to learn a lot and figure out the solution that works for you. But it doesn't need to be like from 0 to 100% straight away. So as we say before, like if managing Kubernetes is not in your feeling right now, just start using the API and a managed version. If you feel like you can, in some way pick, think about what you really need and start from there and iterate on it.
All right, Sherry, you back with us?
Yeah, I am.
All right, what's your best advice to people short of buying something from your company as we exit?
So I would say regarding Kubernetes, it's always about, having the right processes in place. Even if you have the best tools in place, you have to have the right process in order to really do what you need to do. So either if it's, DevSecOps, DevOps, you need to make sure that, in terms of, if we're speaking about security, for example, or like open source security, so the tools that we discussed, you need to actually take your existing processes that you already have in your company and basically just align them with the security standards that you want to have as an organization. And this goes for Kubernetes, since it's the hottest thing right now, but it goes also for any other type of technology that you would like to sort of implement in your organization.
All right, my advice to people would be to make like Gianluca, get yourself an SRE certification and a raise to go with it. And then from there, folks, download the white paper that you can see next to your button there somewhere on the screen. All right, folks. Hey, thanks everybody for sharing their expertise today. You guys were awesome.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
All right, guys,
Thank you.
have a great day, and everybody else, best of luck in your future endeavors.